Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 55 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. Before the curtain rises on our episode today, I'd be grateful if you would consider becoming a patron of the podcast. For less than the price of a couple of ice creams at the interval, your support will help me to continue to make the podcast without the intrusion of advertising. Patrons also enjoy additional content about the plays we cover. My heartfelt thanks go to our newest patrons, Jody Rylett, Grace Harvey, and Lubert Stryer. Thank you very much for your support. For more information about becoming a patron, visit patreon.com/theplaypodcast. Thank you. And now, on with today's episode. The curtain rises on a young teenage girl. Her mother is making a dress for her, one that is long enough to cover every inch of her budding body. The girl naturally resists her mother's sartorial control, feeling the urge to throw off the constraints of childhood. In fact, she knows little about the impulses that she is feeling, and her mother is determined to shelter her from the dangerous realities. The girl lives in a provincial town in late 19th century Germany, but she is absorbed by the ageless concerns of her time of life: school, friends, boys, and most acutely, the urgent mysteries of sexuality. Her mother's conventional discomfort with educating her on the facts of life and the moral prurience of the society that she inhabits lead to disastrous consequences as she and her teenage peers seek to discover secrets of the adult world. This is the opening of German playwright Frank Wedekind's dark, expressionist play, Spring Awakening, a children's tragedy. The play was written in 1891, and it is an extraordinarily frank depiction of teenage anxiety and sexuality, which includes graphic scenes of masturbation, sadomasochism, homosexuality, and rape, as well as suicide and abortion. The play was so controversial in its time that it was 15 years before it was first performed in 1906 in Berlin, and only then with cuts demanded by the censor. It is a nightmarish, cautionary portrait of adolescent angst and rebellion against oppressive social strictures and family pressures. The play is also the unlikely source for the modern rock musical of the same name, which premiered on Broadway in 2006 and was recently revived at the Almeida Theatre in London in a storming new production directed by their artistic director, Rupert Gould. The musical retains much of the dark narrative of the original, adding a score that enunciates all of the young people's yearnings, fears, and frustrations, as well as their hopeful energy and defiance, though it arguably also softens some of the shock of Wedekind's original play. To talk us through the contemporary controversies and enduring power of Spring Awakening, I'm delighted to welcome the Professor of Modern German Literature at New College, Oxford, Karen Leeder. Hello, Karen. Thanks for joining me.
Hello, it's good to be here.
I wonder if we could start, Karen, if you could tell us who Frank Wedekind was and where this play came from in his life and career.
Yes, so born 1864, had a kind of slightly itinerant childhood, moving Germany to Switzerland, and a troubled relationship with his father in particular, who was strict and was determined that the young Wedekind should study law, whereas his inclinations were more literary. And he started writing quite young. This was really his first play. And it owes a debt, I guess, in German literature to greats like Georg Büchner. And Wedekind at the time was sort of influenced by so-called Jung Deutschland, which was a movement of young writers in the 19th century who were also fighting against the kind of repressive, moralistic, authoritarian atmosphere prevailing in 19th century Germany. So Wedekind started writing some sketches, which were really sort of almost verbatim sketches of young people talking about sexuality, children, girls and boys. And these developed into Spring Awakening. It was a scandalous play at the time, of course it still is in a sense, and couldn't be performed, as you said, for 15 years. And his whole theatrical career was like that, challenging the mores of the time. He went on to have some success, but it was always tinged with scandal. Later, he was imprisoned, for example, and he died relatively young, aged 54. So it was a life of challenge, a life of theatre, but theatre always challenging what the theatre could do.
It's fascinating you say that the origins were verbatim sketches or recordings, because the play, as we'll come to, certainly has this fantastic authenticity, I think, of voice from adolescent young people, and very frank as well, as we've said. And it's also interesting that you mentioned his father, because there are a number of troubled relationships with parents in the play. So we get some idea where this might have come from. We said earlier that it wasn't put on for 15 years, but I was interested also to discover that it was published. So young people did know it, even though it hadn't had a production. Is that right?
I think that's right. It had a kind of small limited edition publication, but he knew, that he was challenging what the theatre could do in a number of ways, actually. The first production was censored significantly, so that some of the most shocking scenes were taken out and some were kind of mitigated. So, for example, the abortion methods that are talked about couldn't be mentioned specifically. And the masturbation scene was gone, and various shocking things. So he knew when he was writing that he was challenging what was permissible in terms of censorship. But also there were two other things that stretched the theatre. One was that there were lots of scenes, lots of very short scenes, and we moved between different places very fast, between outside and inside, between the natural world and school, for example, people's homes. And that was very challenging for the theatre as well. It was play in many ways to be read at that time, because simply the scene changes were very challenging. But also, finally, and again, he knew this entirely because he was a theatre man himself and interested in cabaret and the theatre, and acted also in this play. And when it finally could be performed, German theatre works, and still the case, with ensembles. So you have a set ensemble of actors. And this play demands so many young people, and simply there wouldn't have been that many young actors. And it's kind of unthinkable to have adults doing this. It makes it very awkward, I think. And so he knew, actually, I think, writing the play, that it was a direct assault on the theatre in almost every way.
That's fascinating now that you mentioned that, because I have some involvement in amateur theatre as well. And one of the most difficult challenges is to do plays with young people in them, to be able to cast it and how you manage the young cast as well, obviously. I would love to get to more about the form of the play, as you've just mentioned, but perhaps for listeners who are not familiar with it, could you give us a brief synopsis of what actually happens?
Sure. Well, you mentioned the young girl who is central, and as you say, we start off in her room with her growing up and sensing the sort of draw to the older world and her instincts and the outside world. And then we move very swiftly from her to seeing some of the other young children who will become central. So they're sort of 14, 15-year-old sort of adolescents who are on the brink of entering puberty and thinking about sexuality, but they exist in this repressive atmosphere of school, religion, and home. And these three things together kind of crush the life out of them. And so we move between the boys discussing their sort of sexual instincts, but also the shame that's with them. And so we introduce primarily to two central characters, Moritz, who feels ashamed of his burgeoning sexuality and is oppressed by school and his feelings of failure at school and his parents' disappointment with him, and Melchior, who is the other main character, who is a very fascinating character, a bright, sensitive young man who has more liberal parents who've granted him a lot more autonomy, so he knows about sex, for example, but is also sort of playing roles of cynicism and nihilism in order to impress his friends, but also because he doesn't quite know what to do with that. So we hear about them, and then we see girls also talking about their frustrations and wondering what they're going to be when they grow older and have children, imagining how they will bring up their children. And so the sort of scene is set then for the crisis, which comes in the form of Moritz feels he's failing at school and is driven to kill himself out of a sense of shame and failure. Melchior has given him an account of sexuality which has slipped into one of his textbooks because Moritz wanted to know about it. The teachers have discovered this. And then, of course, Melchior comes under the wrath of the school and is finally sent to reformatory. At the same time, while this is happening, Wendler hears from one of her friends, Martha, who is regularly beaten by her parents. And this awakens a kind of sense of masochism in Wendla, which she doesn't really know what to do with. And when she chances on Melchior in the forest, she begs him to beat her. At first he refuses, but then he does and viciously attacks her and is ashamed of that. And then when they meet again, they have sex up in a hayloft, possibly rape. It's very difficult to exactly know. It's one of the many things that happens off set, as it were. We don't see things happen. So they're all headed to ruin, of course. Wendla is pregnant, doesn't know that she is, and we see her mother palming her off with various counts of what might be wrong with her, and then calling in an abortionist, and Wendla dies. Melchior, as I've said, is sent to reformatory. Moritz has committed suicide, and in a chilling scene in the churchyard, his father disowns him, said that boy wasn't mine. And then finally, there's a strange last scene, which I'm sure we'll come to talk about, in which the ghost of Moritz comes back in the graveyard. Melchior has escaped from the reformatory, which is a brutalizing place, and is in the graveyard, sees Wendla's grave, feels devastated and guilty. Moritz comes as a ghost with his head under his arm and says, just touch my hand and I'll take you away with me and you can become a ghost, you can leave this world too. And then a strange masked man appears, played by Wedekind in the first productions, and draws Melchior away from death towards life and takes him with him from the graveyard. So I'm sorry, it's a sort of slightly strange account of the play, but it's very bitty. And there are these different strands of stories. That's why it's so hard to produce, in a sense, which lead to this final, well, which I might call a kind of an affirmation of life at the end.
Well, it was brilliant, actually. You've got all the main events and characters and also some sense of what these young people, what their lives are about at this stage of life, in particular the pressures they're under, which, as you mentioned with Moritz, it's a lot of pressure coming from his home, his parents, their expectation of him. So, failure at school is not an option for him, as well as, of course, these burgeoning feelings about sex, which they, to a lesser or greater degree, don't understand, but aren't given an opportunity to learn either. So the boys resort to looking up pictures in encyclopedias, and the parents are deliberately not telling them the facts of life, all of which leads to disaster. We'll come back to some of the characters and events in more detail in a minute, but I wanted to return to you touching on the form of the play and these different scenes, because I've seen it described as the birth of expressionist theater. And I wondered what the elements that define expressionist theater that are in this play are. I mean, is the short tense scenes part of it? What else is there that defines it as expressionist theater?
Yes, it's interesting that it's called that because it's a strange beast of a play. So on the one hand, there are expressionist elements. So, for example, the strange masked man that nobody knows who he is. And there are also teachers. The school teachers all have generic, rather comic names in English, bone grinder and so on. So they're unlike characters and they speak in a kind of absurd academic jargon style. And the parents, too, are very little delineated. So they're almost generic figures, which we might come to know from expressionist theatre, not with any kind of reality or psychological reality about them. But also, as you say, the short scenes, very explosive scenes, and also sometimes very short language, kind of short, explosive, compacted, dense language. So all that is very expressionist. But there is a naturalist element to this. And I think that's what makes it fascinating. It's a real mixture, a theatrical conundrum. So, for example, all the children are delineated in great detail. We get a lot of stage directions about where they should be, outside or inside, and we see the settings. And their language is more varied. It's not so formulaic. It varies between the vivid speech of the everyday and then some rather highfalutin academic language. And so I think that there's naturalism there, there's expressionism there, and it's a kind of beast which doesn't really settle into any single form.
That's really well phrased. It's a real challenging play in that regard. It's surprising. There's the expressionist elements and the surreal elements, particularly at the end. You described it. There's a ghost of Moritz appears with his head under his arm, and this masked man who's a spirit of some kind, but we don't know what. And yet, as you say, in a relatively naturalistic setting in other respects. But there are all sorts of those elements that are not naturalistic. And one of which I wanted to ask you about was the language. You mentioned it being highfalutin or explosive, and it is strangely lurid and intense, isn't it? Poetic, symbolic, quite philosophical at times. And I found in a couple of translations that it varied quite a lot. So I wondered, is this true in German as well? You will know it, I'm sure, in the original. How would you describe what the language is? Because it's quite hard to get a handle on for a modern English audience, I think.
I think that's completely right. And so looking ahead, I know we'll discuss the musical that you mentioned. It's kind of interesting to see how the musical deals with that sort of language. So I think one of the challenges for any theatre company wanting to stage this is the language, which on the one hand is poetic. So particularly when it's to do with the natural world, we constantly feel the sort of warm winds from outside. There's the scent of lilac, the scent of violets later. There's the bird song, which poor Moritz, once he's been learning his Greek verbs all night, he falls asleep briefly over his books and then is woken by the song, the dawn chorus. So there's a very lush and poetic invocation of the natural world and the kind of rising of spring and the rising of sap and the sort of feeling that the young people at least are in tune with that. But then, for example, I mentioned the teachers who speak in a kind of comic, satirical jargon. They're meant to be deciding the fate of Melchior, who will be sent away from the school, but all they can do is actually debate in very highfalutin terms whether to open a window or not, in a kind of real caricature scene, which again doesn't belong in this play at all in terms of the sort of theatrical wholeness of it.
No, it's completely absurd, isn't it? And
yes,
at the risk of offense, it's a fantastic piss take of the academic world and the meeting of these academics who debate in highfalutin terms whether the window should be open or closed. I was interested you also talked about the images of the natural world, because the other thing that struck me is that there's a lot of dark and striking imagery in the language in the play as well. Some of them are fabulous images. One that struck me and I made a note of was one of the girls. They talk, as you said earlier, about imagining having their own children. And one of them, Thea, I think it is, describes how her children will all be dressed head to toe in pink, except for their stockings, which will be black. And they will parade in front of her in single file. It's a fantastic image, isn't it? Also, of course, rather suggestive of the contrast between innocence and the unknown darknesses of sex, I suppose. And also, of course, even more bizarrely, Moritz tells this bizarre story that his grandmother tells to him about a queen who is born with no head, and she is overthrown by a king with two heads. But the king's two heads quarrel all the time. So one of his is given to the queen, and then they marry, and they spend all their time kissing, now that she has a head. And Moritz, of course, sees himself without a head. And when he sees a beautiful girl, she is without a head, all of which is exotic and surreal and a bit symbolic. It also ties into the end when he actually shoots himself in the head and he carries his own head in the graveyard. The play is full of these strange images as well, which must be part of this expressionist style, I suppose.
It's very experimental in many ways. You mentioned the final scene and the masked man, and I've long had the sense that this is a kind of theatrical experiment for Wedekind, that he's trying out these different modes, these different languages, these strange elements of storytelling, which sort of burst in, the symbolism. And then, but how can you resolve a play like that? You can't. And so in a sense, I see this most bizarre final scene in the graveyard as a kind of theatrical cul-de-sac, really. How can he get out of it? So he has to bring on this strange masked man to solve it. And you have to read it at a symbolic level. So there we've left behind any kind of naturalism. But it seems to me that it's the gods coming down, really. It's a sort of modern version of that, to solve this beast of a play that's going in all different directions. But yes, I mean, that's part of the excitement of the play, I think, to be honest. It's so vivid, quite apart from the action, which of course is still shocking, I think. The language is so shocking in that it never settles into a single mode. And you were talking about different languages, and the one thing I didn't get around to mentioning was there's a scene, Hans Rulo locks himself in a toilet, one of the young lads, and masturbates, but is so repressed by his shame that what he does is he steals these pictures of classical nudes of statues and goddesses, and then consigns the pictures to death in the toilet when he's finished. But that scene, again, is an extraordinary fantasy language made up of little bits of classical learning, kind of misunderstood and thrown together. And again, it's a sort of tour de force in its own sense, but it doesn't fit in really anywhere with the rest of the play. It's a kind of hyper-realism, if anything. It's very, very bizarre.
Yes, there are classical references strewn throughout, actually, which you would need footnotes to follow all the way through. And again, it's not naturalistic, that use of those references. And in particular, I loved, as you say, the masked man at the end. And the final stage direction reads something along the lines, they fly away over the graves. It's a fantastic stage direction. So I'm not sure how you stage it, but that's another matter. It is a brilliant form. And as you say, the excitement is in all these strange elements that don't necessarily go easily together. And this may be a bit of a simplistic question, but I wondered, what about the play's title? What do you think it signifies? I mean, I suppose the most obvious is the character's adolescent sexual awakening. Is there more to that?
That's an interesting question. So you're right, we have the sense of the burgeoning sexuality and them waking to their sexuality. There's also a very strong sense of spring in the text, again, as I've said, all the way through. But then also it looks forward to a kind of winter also. There are elements of winter or darkness projected into the future. And so it draws into a kind of cyclical or an inevitability of the disaster. I mean, the subtitle, of course, is a children's tragedy.
Yes.
And so we do have that always pointing forward to darkness and death. I know that certainly one commentator has suggested that the masked man might be saving Melchior from death for life, but what's going to happen is the First World War. And of course, you can't really think that Wedekind saw that coming. I'm not saying that there's a sort of prophetic element to the play, but what I do think is that all the way through, and this goes back to what you were saying about that expressionist symbolism all the way through, that the burgeoning and the energy and the life is always balanced against a sense of inevitable darkness. It's very elemental in that sense.
That's true too. And it just made me think, of course, with the seasonal metaphoric framework and the positive symbols of nature and spring, set against what one could interpret as the winter of social repression, the sterility of social repression, that there's an alternative. The young people represent an alternative to that. The energy of youth is set against the repression of the adult world.
I think that's completely right. And that fits very strongly, doesn't it, with the idea of the schoolroom, the airless schoolroom, where they're not going to open a window. But also the sense, which we haven't really talked about, which is that the parents in particular are simply enacting what happened to them. Wendler's mother at one point says it explicitly, I'm only doing to you what my good mother did to me. And so while we might be very critical of the parents, and I think the play is very critical of the parents, also they are continuing a long line of repression. They are victims, in a sense, too, of a kind of morality, of the morality of the time.
One of the central themes must be that the emerging sexual desire that the adolescents feel is set against the social mores that restrict their behavior, and of course inform the adults in their unwillingness to educate them or to be open about it. And that they, as you say, it's morality that they've inherited. And obviously, I suspect Wedekind is suggesting that things have to change, that these moralities shouldn't continue to pertain because they're dangerous and damaging. Isn't there essentially, if you look at what happens to these young people, this kind of moral repression is responsible for the tragedies that occur. Is that not right?
Completely. So all of them suffer from the moral repression around them. Fleur is condemned to ignorance by her mother. She doesn't know about sex. She doesn't know why her mother is making her dress longer. At one point, her mother says, well, you can only get... She begs to know about sex, and her mother says, well, you really have to love a man. And so when she's in the hayloft with Melchior, she doesn't love him, he doesn't love her. And so she has no sense that she could get pregnant. There's a sort of innocence, which a really harmful, repressive atmosphere has condemned that innocence.
Yeah, she literally, of course, does not know anything about it. Her mother tells her that babies are delivered by storks. Her older sister has a baby during the play, and her mother tells her that's where it came from, determined to not tell her the truth. And she relents only in far as to say, you have to be married for a start. And so Wendla still doesn't even understand how anything can happen to her because she isn't married. I mean, it's ignorance of that level. And of course, the boys as well are kept in ignorance. Moritz knows nothing, and as you said, feels the shame at knowing nothing and not being able to deal with that. And then Melchior writes his essay entitled On Copulation, which of course challenges the teachers, and they think it's pornographic that he would even know this sort of thing. I guess it goes back to this thing about nature too. There's a conflict between the natural instincts and social mores, isn't there? I mean, early on, Melchior talks about how if two cats of the opposite sex were put together, and no matter whether they were educated or not, they would eventually procreate. And one of the themes is obviously about education, not just sex education. And you mentioned the schoolmasters. I think that Wedekind seems to have a pretty caustic view of the established form of education generally, doesn't he? I mean, the schoolmasters' names. We have headmaster's sunstroke, professor's tongue twister, fly swatter, gut grinder.
And the head of the reformatory is Dr. Procrustes, the mythical name of the person who let people lie on his bed on their journey, but then had to be stretched or amputated in order to fit the bed. And so there again, it's a very telling image of education.
Ah, fantastic.
Yes, I mean, so education as it was, this learning by rote, and this huge amount of homework that seems to have no relevance to their lives. And then the attitude that it's not about learning for life in any sense, it's just continuing the system, propagating the way it's always been done. I think that is very squarely criticised by Wedekind. But there's another sort of image of education in the text. So I said that Melchior has slightly more liberal parents. That's not quite true. His father is strict, but his mother is more liberal and has allowed him to make choices and have a certain kind of moral independence. And at one point, she comes across Melchior and Moritz reading Faust and is slightly worried about the content because in Goethe's Faust, Faust is a scholar. So I think there is an interesting link. This idea of education is really very much at the heart of the play, who is then tempted by Mephistopheles, the devil, to see the world and go and experience life. And he has sex with Gretchen, a woman he falls in love with, and she becomes pregnant. But because of the shame, kills her baby. So there are two interesting things there. First of all, there's the sort of slightly more liberal education from the mother. But also there's a story about education there and the failures of education, I think, which Wedekind is constantly referring to in the text. It's one of the intertexts of this play.
Yes, exactly. I think age old in a way, it's still with us, this question of what the nature of education should be. There's a great line from Moritz where I think he says, what do we go to school for? To be examined. And why are we examined? So we can fail. I mean, even I think this might be a familiar cry of generations of school children for whom the educational curriculum is an inappropriate misery. And, the kind of strict curriculum decisions that are being constantly revisited, even in our own time, it's an issue that never goes away, I suppose.
I think you're right.
And then there's the parents. It's not a great advertisement for parenting, is it? The play. None of them really get it right. There's a fantastic, ironic moment at Moritz's funeral where the priest, of course, refers to the commandment, honor thy father and thy mother. And you mentioned Melchior's mother. So there are different models of parenting on display, none of them very successful, as I've said. We see lots of strict discipline, but only really Melchior's mother appears to want to be a different kind of more liberal parent. But even she isn't altogether successful, is she? And then she and her husband represent different sides to the spectrum on discipline, for example. Melchior's mother believes that Melchior's old enough to know what's good for him, that he can do whatever he feels able to answer for to his own conscience. And she trusts him as long as he doesn't give her reason to, although she's not completely open, you say, with the Goethe. But the father is a more fundamental disciplinarian. And when Melchior is expelled for having written the On Copulation, which the teachers, I meant to say, took as an incitement to Moritz to kill himself. They thought that this was somehow responsible for Moritz's suicide.
Yes. And Ironically, I mean, when Melchior is being questioned about this, although he doesn't get to say very much, the teachers won't let him. They've decided what's going to happen. The Inquisition, as it were, is predetermined. Then he says, but tell me anything that I've written in that treatise that isn't true, that isn't simply factual.
Exactly, yes.
But that doesn't really matter. I think it's the fact of him writing it and the fact of him communicating it, the fact of him challenging this ignorance.
Well, there's an extraordinary line. I mean, I'm not sure whether I've imagined this, but I think there was a line somewhere from the teachers. Their number one priority is to protect their institution. And they talk about the fact that there's a spate of suicides going on at other institutions. And that if it reaches a level where 25% of the school population has killed itself, then the authorities will step in. And you're thinking, what?
No, you're completely right. You're not imagining it. Yeah.
That's just crazy. So obviously something's wrong, something's sick in the world here.
And it's one of the very few places where we lift our heads from a very tight focus on this provincial place and the drama between these characters to see it also symptomatic of a historical moment.
That's true. Yes, wow. It nearly passed me by that, but it's clear that they don't have the children's interests at heart particularly. They're just trying to protect the institution. And thinking about the parents, that the father blames Melchior and thinks that his behavior comes from lack of discipline, which is why they decide he has to go to the reformatory. And there's a line his father uses that the reformatory will teach him, the boy will finally learn to put the good before the interesting and to act not according to his nature, but according to the rules. We couldn't have it more clearly set out, the conflict or choice between nature and the rules, and also adventure or the good, which we'll come to in the end. And one of the other aspects of education, I think, isn't true, you mentioned it earlier, Karen, was that they're educated to feel shame. And it is one of the most powerful, insidious forces in the play, isn't it? The shame that these children feel. It drives a lot of their feelings and behavior.
I think that's right. Moritz, as we've said before, feels ashamed for his burgeoning sexuality, particularly because he doesn't understand it. And even when he's about to kill himself, he's crippled with shame for not having had sex, not having done the most human thing. But particularly he feels ashamed for his parents as well, in that he has failed at school and is a disappointment to them, even though he works so hard constantly. And so it's a crippling sense of shame, which narrows his world, narrows his being, until there's only one option left for him. And in fact, just before he dies, Ilsa, who we haven't mentioned, who is a strange half creature, another child, but one who embodies a kind of life force, comes to him and seems potentially to offer him to have sex, but he can't even grasp it then. He says he's got homework to do, but in fact, of course, he knows he's going to kill himself. So there's this crippling shame which allows them no action. They can't, there's only one path for them.
It's tragic, isn't it? It's so poignant. Moritz's self-loathing and the shame he feels, and the pressure of his parents is just terrible to witness. This is underscored even more, isn't it, in the scene of his funeral, because Wedekind shows his father condemning his son for having failed, not in grief at his suicide, it would appear, or losing him, but for having shamed him, even in social terms. It's just shocking. You know, he pulls no punches, does he?
Absolutely brutal scene, yes.
It's interesting in the musical, they softened that. We'll talk about the music maybe if we have some time, but in the musical, he breaks down and is grieving. There's nothing explicit in the stage directions that would suggest that's the case, frankly, in the play. And it seems to me more powerful in a cold and cruel way that he disowns his own son.
Oh, no, it's devastating. And the other people at the funeral urge him to look after himself. You know, the terrible thing reflects on him and his wife, and that he deserves the sympathy. Yes, it's a brutal scene.
What about the shame of Vendla then? So she's desperate to know something about sex. Her mother is not telling her anything, and she gets drawn into this encounter with Melchior. And the first scene, which again is somewhat shocking and certainly puzzling, is that you mentioned her friend Martha, who we learn is being beaten by her parents. Another classic example of wonderful parenting. Her parents literally beat her, and put her to bed in a sackcloth done up to her neck, a pretty literal symbol of enforced chastity. But Wendla, when she meets Melchior, there's this strange scene, isn't it, where she asks him to beat her with a willow branch. And initially, I think, as you said, Melchior resists, but then does, and does it increasingly intense. She asks him to hit her harder. What is she doing there? What is going on? What's the psychology that's being displayed by Wendla here?
It's fascinating, isn't it? The other thing one should say is that they have a conversation in that scene about how she visits the poor. And Melchior is in his sort of rather cynical philosophical mode, and he's trying to understand whether she does it out of a sense of altruism or whether actually she gets something from it, feels good about it. And she does say that she does feel good to do it. And so it confirms his worldview that there's no such thing really as morality or altruism. It's all about doing what makes you happy. And so we move from this rather awkward conversation to this sadomasochism that comes kind of from nowhere, actually. I think when you first read it, you expect that they might kiss or they might have sex at this point. That's delayed and it explodes into violence. And when he's beating her with the switch, it's not enough. And she keeps asking him to do it harder. And then at one point he throws the switch away and actually pummels her until the scene ends with this terrible scream. And of course, he feels shame about that later. He runs off sobbing into the distance. But it seems to me that this is one of these moments when you see the result of the repression. It's like there's a lid on everything, on all the kind of natural urges. Nobody's allowed to explore anything. And so when there's a moment when it can come out, it comes out as this unexplainable, extreme violence. It just comes out in a destructive way. And that's the result of the repression. I don't think it's unlinked.
Definitely. And I don't think they understand where it's coming from consciously. Although it's interesting, you see that philosophical debate is connected in some way because Wendla does have questions, as Melchior questions her, about how selflessly is she really doing this work, this charitable work with the poor? Is she not actually getting something out of it herself and feeling good about herself? And therefore it's a selfish and self-righteous act. So she begins to feel maybe some guilt about that. And then there's the element with Martha, where she says weirdly that she wants to understand what Martha's experienced. And maybe there's some genuine thinking, well, I'd like to be capable of an empathy. If I haven't had these experiences, like I haven't been poor either, I haven't understood what it means to be disadvantaged or beaten. So I need to learn from experience somehow. And that will give me more genuine empathy and understanding of the world. And finally, as you said, I think actually it's made more explicit in the musical that she's not found any outlet for her physical urges that she doesn't understand. And I think in the music, she actually says something like she just wants to feel something. So you can see where that might lead to this. And then, as you say, the violence, I mean, Melchior explodes into this violence from somewhere as well, presumably from some frustration deep down. And then the second scene between them. This is a fascinating encounter as well, isn't it? In the hayloft. Now, it's not explicit, is it? But how do you interpret what's gone on in the hayloft? It's left, I think, a lot to the director to work out how to interpret what occurs. It's not explicit, although we see later the result is that Wendla becomes pregnant, of course, and Melchior writes to Wendla apologizing that he has wronged her, so must feel some guilt in that respect. The interpretation is that he's taken advantage of her, that he's raped her. Is that the way to interpret this? And what do we take as Wendla's response in the scene as it's written?
I think that's right. I mean, I think especially from our perspective today, Wendla is 14 and a half. She cannot have given consent. I mean, she didn't know what she might have been consenting to. So it must be rape. But it's interestingly played out. Melchior is in the hayloft and Wendla comes to him and won't go away. She wants to be with him and she wants to talk to him, and he tells her to go away on a number of occasions, but she stays. And then he warns her, if you don't go. And then we have this, again, very discreet. It's not explicit at all in the stage directions what happens, but we learn retrospectively from the letter and from the fact of her pregnancy. And I think that because of the nature of the relationship between them, we do understand it as a sort of sense of him overpowering her because of that violence that's been between them. But she comes away with a kind of happiness and a feeling of knowledge at last, I think, and experience, and a kind of poetic sort of sense of not love, because she says she doesn't love him, but something. Life, I think, maybe life.
Yes, you're right. I mean, clearly this is not consent because she says no repeatedly. And we know she doesn't know what's happening, really. But it is fascinating, the rhythms of the dialogue as you look at it, full of ellipses. So it allows for the kissing to continue as they speak. It's beautifully orchestrated. But you're right that afterwards, there's this very short scene where she is picking violets in the garden and can't suppress her smile, it says, or something like that in the stage direction. Or she says to herself,
yes,
and she's desperate to tell someone what's happened. She hasn't learned to feel the shame, in fact, which goes back to Melchior said at one stage, shame is nothing but a product of education. You have to be taught to feel shameful.
Completely. When you mentioned Wendler and shame, I almost leapt in at that point and said, but Wendler doesn't feel shame. I mean, that's one of the interesting things about her. She's women in Wedekind, not only in this play, but in others too. Women are much closer to the elemental, to the natural, and very often seem to embody a kind of being which closer to desire and closer to wanting. That archetypal contrast in Wedekind all the way through, which the masked man mentions, wollen and sollen, wanting and having to, that dichotomy which rules life. And they are on the side generally of wanting to, but they often suffer for that. And I think Wendler is in that line.
Yes, and Ilse possibly too, who also suffers for it. Wendler had shame initially about not knowing, but she didn't seem to have shame when she knows. It must have been an extraordinary scene to put on the stage in its time. And another extraordinary scene would be the scenes of masturbation, which we haven't talked about in detail. You mentioned one of them, but also homosexuality. There's a scene between Ernst and Haschen, two of the other students, where they lie in the grass and feed each other grapes and kiss. And Ernst says he loves him, and they vow to cream off the top of life. That must have been fantastically bold to write and stage at that time, wouldn't it?
Oh, yes, I think that was one of the ones that was just cut
Okay.
in the first production. But it's interesting because as they are doing this, they're also sort of fantasizing about their future. All the children spend their time imagining futures instead of living in the present.
That's right.
And they're imagining a life as a pastor with a wife and children and a kind of good life. And again, continuing the respectable life, even as they are allowing themselves to indulge their real feelings and their real appetites. But again, it's just one of these odd, complete scenes in Wedekind, like the masturbation scene, which sort of come in and a kind of lyric snapshot, almost a symbolic snapshot, really. Very poignant and beautifully written and idyllic, and again, in the natural world. And tender, actually, tender after the brutality we talked about.
Yes, very much so. That's fantastically put. And then when they're talking about their future, there's a sort of, am I right in saying there's a sort of knowingness that what they have at this moment cannot actually continue? They will have to have this more conventional life, but that they will grab this moment. This is just one moment. And 30 years' time, they'll look back and still at least have had this moment. It's a lyrical and tender scene. When we talk about the ending, fantastic last scene when Melchior has found Wendler's grave and blames himself for her death, inevitably. Then the ghost of Morris appears, and they have a philosophical debate about life and death, and Moritz actually tempts him to join him in the afterlife. What did you make of what these figures represent? What is Wedekind leaving us with at the conclusion of the debate?
Yeah, so Moritz is calling Melchior to the afterlife with him, and depicts it at first as a life of serenity and a kind of universal knowledge, actually, a bit like the angels in Wings of Desire, the Wim Wenders film, that they are party to all that happens in the world, but don't affect it. And so he says he was there at his funeral, kind of hovering, and that he's in people's rooms sometimes, and that he knows everything that's going. And so he's tempting him with what? Serenity and knowledge, and trying to draw him into death as the opposite of this wretched and restricted life that Melchior has. And it's only when the masked man suddenly appears, because I think Melchior is tempted. It's his friend, he's fond of him, and he's tempted to that.
He's also full of self-disgust and he's lost hope.
Yes, completely. Yes, and he feels guilty about Wendler and sorry for Moritz. But then the masked man appears, sort of striding across the graves. Apparently, he was dressed up in a top hat and tails in the first productions, and Wedekind played him. A bit like a circus figure, ringmaster maybe. He appears and reveals that what Moritz is saying about his afterlife is wrong, that actually it's miserable, that he's under the ground and alone, and there's this sort of eternal horror, and that Moritz was wanting company. Moritz was wanting to draw Melchior to that world with him. And Moritz indeed apologizes afterwards and wishes him well, allows him to choose life, go with the masked man. Yes, and so the masked man, it's very difficult. I mean, Melchior constantly wants to know who the man is. You know, what is the choice that he's offering him? So there's death with Moritz, or what? And the masked man doesn't tell him. He says, well, you know, you have to come and try it in order to know what it is. You have to take my hand. And then, in a very interesting echo of Faust, he says, I'll take you out into the world. I'll give you the chance to widen your horizon in astonishing ways. I'll introduce you to every single interesting thing in the world. Now, that's very fascinating, because that allies him with Mephistopheles in Faust, the devil, tempting the scholar out into experience, into the world, into every sensual aspect of life that there could be. But even then, we're still not sure. We're still not sure who he is or what he represents. So it's really the thing I mentioned before, the should versus would, sollen and wollen in German, which is the crux of Wedekind's thinking. But also, I think, death and a kind of giving up and an acceptance of this narrow and restricted world, and the sense that you can't see beyond it and you fall victim to it, or life, whatever that brings. And that's what Melchior then chooses.
It's fantastically rich, actually. The imagery that's struck just in that framework is very powerful. Moritz's description of what it's like in the afterlife. But it is a telling thing that gives away, I think, part of it, where he says that they're all alone, the spirits. So perhaps he's wanting company, but I'm not sure he's even allowed company. They all have to survive on their own. There's no interaction between other spirits. None of us has anything it would hurt him to lose. Mm. In a way, if there's no love, there's no pain or grief. But if there's no pain or grief, there's no love. You have that pain and that love in the real world if you embrace life. It's a gamble, as you just said, take my hand, we don't know what it'll be, but I will show you everything. And then there's that debate about morality. It's quite philosophical at points as well, where the terms you said, should and would, are used. There's something about that morality is an artificial construct. Imaginary forces, which we call duty or free will or should or would. And Moritz admits that this imagined morality has hounded him to his death. So again, those sort of social strictures and that kind of morality is set against living in a way. And as you say, he questions, who is the devil? Do these figures represent different parts of Melchior's own psyche even? Better or lesser selves, good or evil, the devil or not? Doesn't he ask at one point if the masked man is the devil, or trying to figure out which of them is the devil?
Yes.
So Wedekind is championing what in the end? What is he leaving us with in the options that are presented?
I think it goes back to the question we had about knowledge and shame, ignorance and knowledge. At one point, the masked man says that Moritz can have his comforting knowledge of having nothing, whereas if Melchior comes with him, he will have the tormenting doubt of everything.
That's a great line, isn't it?
It's a fantastic line. So it's the sort of opposite of the nihilism which Melchior had at the beginning, and opening into the uncertainty of a full experience of life. I said that Wedekind was a man also of the theatre and the cabaret and the circus. He got very interested in all of those things. And he used at one point the image of a tightrope walker as a kind of living. And I think there's something of that, the precarity of a full engagement in life and the uncertainty, as opposed to the kind of knowledge, but which brings nothing with it.
Well, you would have to think that Wedekind championed the way of life that embraced adventure, curiosity versus the constraints of convention morality. I mean, he lived his life that way, didn't he? He was promiscuous. He had illegitimate children and had fraught relationships with his wife, and he got into all sorts of scrapes. So he lived it fully, I guess. Let's come back to the fact that it's a challenging play, I think, in numbers of ways, isn't it? The language we talked about and the imagery are pretty strange. The graphic sexuality may still also be difficult for some audiences. So I was going to ask you, why do you think we should still do it today, if we should? It's not very often done, I don't think, although the musical is an updated version. We can talk about that. But what about it resonating in our world today?
Well, perhaps I have a slightly odd view of this because it's the first German text that we give our first years to read when they arrive at university.
Oh, wow, that's fantastic.
And it has been for a long time. And so I've watched 18-year-olds whose German isn't up to it really, truly. And this, of course, is pretty much the first play they've ever read. So they have none of the background and none of the understanding grapple with it. And to be fair, I think it is a struggle. But it's something that by the end of the year, they keep coming back to it as a touchstone because it touches on profound and entirely relevant things still today. I mean, the particular historical clothing in which those questions are set are perhaps not quite relevant for our Western culture now, but in other parts of the world, of course, homosexuality or having a child out of wedlock would still be very live issues. And in a sense, what it boils down to is this: the natural, the instinctive versus social constraint, and that tension, which is at the heart of many great tragedies, actually, and is constantly relevant and constantly reinvented in every generation. And it is a coming of age play. And so I think it's useful for young people to see, no matter what the difficulties are, because of its power and because of its craziness, really. I think I think it's quite an assault on everything you probably think about the theatre when you're 18 and perhaps don't have a lot of experience. And so it's very good, I think, to put people in front of it and see how they deal with it.
That's great, that craziness, that assault, but also that, I mean, there's no question, isn't there, that the issues that you just touched on of, instinct versus morality and how our societies deal with that balance in the mores that we apply. I mean, goodness me, you don't have to look very far around the world. The raging debates between the Christian right or fundamentalists, clearly those issues are still there. And the challenges that young people face in finding their own way in the adult world is universal, particularly obviously about sex and the moralities around sex. And of course, about education and how they are educated and how their parents deal with the responsibilities of educating their children, of shepherding somehow from ignorance to a world where they can understand and behave in some constructive and happy way.
Yes, and as a parent of a 19-year-old myself, I mean, I think it's a complicated job. The sense of social morality for someone born in the 1960s like me and someone born in the 2000s is completely different. Society has changed unimaginably over those few decades. So I think it's always relevant.
I think that's right. As a parent, also thinking about that balance of discipline or allowing your children the freedom to make their own mistakes. When you know they don't know, they can't know, do you just let them go out there and discover for themselves? Or when do you decide, I'm going to step in here in the name of protection, which they'll think is restraint? That's age old. I was going to say, you talked about historical clothing, and that brings me, I think we've got a couple of minutes to talk about the musical, because the musical course updates it, I think. It certainly does in the idiom of its language and clearly the music itself, but also I think in some of the attitudes and the way it handles some of the content. I wonder what you thought about the way it changes, because it's not a literal translation of the play. Some of the things are differently handled, and I would suggest even softens some of the harshest, most shocking elements of the original play. And it's ironic in a way that in our modern age, it does that when it's supposed to be bringing it up to date. What did you make of some of those decisions or the musical overall?
Well, I know that the musical is very controversial. I mean, it's hugely successful, and I think 2006 was the first time, and that it's had major iterations and won many awards. So it's very, very successful, but also very controversial. So Edward Bond, who was one of the most significant translators of this play, criticised it very firmly as belonging to precisely the world which the play is arguing against.
Yeah, he said in trying to make the play up to date, it trivializes it and makes it sentimental and saccharine. I don't think he thought much of modern culture generally, must be said, but I think he may not be far off the mark in that one. I'll come to that in a second. Carry on. Sorry, I interrupted.
Well, I was going to say that I think what it does is it moves the dilemmas inside the heads. It sort of psychologizes the characters so that they have songs about their feelings. It tells us what the characters are feeling instead of these rather absurd external things that happen in the Wedekind. So there is a shift and there is a softening, maybe, but it's very difficult to know what would be as shocking nowadays as these events then. And can we be shocked still? How can we be shocked in the same way still? I'm not sure that we can.
No, I suppose not. And I guess, a number of the elements are still there. We're not shocked by homosexuality, for example. But they do take some decisions to soften, as you say. So, for example, the rape scene in the musical, it's absolutely not presented as rape. It's presented as consensual sex. If anything, even Wendla takes the initiative, and it's two young people exploring their first sexual experience together. And therefore, their story becomes almost like Romeo and Juliet. And in fact, when Wendla has the abortion, she actually dreams of having the child and living with Melchior as a family and all this. And in the play, of course, she has no understanding of what's happening to her. And I think it's far more brutal the way the play deals with all of that story for both of them.
It's interesting, they shift things around. So that vision of Wendla successfully having a baby comes from the masked man in the Wedekind. And the masked man tells Melchior in the graveyard that if she'd been left to her own devices, she would, of course, have had a healthy baby. And who knows what would have happened to them. I don't think we're meant to think that they would have been together and had a happy relationship. But I think the musical shifts things around and puts the emphasis very firmly on a much easier equation. So on the one side, the good, the children, and the burgeoning sexuality, and on the other side, the repressive. And so it cuts out some of the complicated things, which is that embracing the natural can involve brutality as well, because after all, the natural is brutal too.
Yes. The ending is also softened, it seemed to me, because in the musical, the masked man doesn't appear as a character. Moritz does appear, but not to entice him to suicide. He and Wendla together tell Melchior, don't worry, we all love you. You can be sustained in life by the memory and enduring love of your friends. And then there's this musical coda where all the young people come together with a sort of anthem of hope. Their dreams will be realized at some point. I suppose in the end of the day, I've just felt like it was a bit of a sellout. A Broadway show ultimately just can't be as dark and pessimistic as the play was. It has to leave us with some uplifting ending and some triumph of what Bond would call sentimental values.
I think you're right. I mean, it's a genre issue. The Hollywood musical ends with a happy ending. It can be poignant, but it is a resolution. Whereas this play actually explodes theatrical norms in almost every regard. And precisely the ending is almost, he's got to this point, and now what can he do? It's a sort of escape from the theatrical into the surreal, which kind of prefigures drama to come by decades.
Yes.
Of course, Freud is also there throughout. So there's a sort of self-consciousness of Freudian thinking, but it's a very modern play, teetering on the end of the 19th century and reaching far into the 20th century, it seems to me, with a kind of unknowing energy.
That's perfectly put. Thank you, Karen. I think that's a great place to stop. Before I let you go, I think I forewarned you that one of the traditions of the podcast is I like to ask my guests to recommend another play that we might do on the podcast, or that's just a personal favorite of yours, because I love to hear about new plays. So, Karen, what would you volunteer as a favorite?
Well, now I'm slightly embarrassed because what I haven't done is double checked on your list to see if my ideas you've already done.
Don't worry, that's allowed.
So I think, oddly, it would be something in the same vein as this, actually, which would be Georg Büchner's Wojciech.
Aha, yes. No, we have not done it.
Well, it's another play that challenges the theatre and the theatrical norms of its day. It's a 19th century play, but it reaches right into the 20th century in an extraordinary way. It's also profoundly politically relevant. It tells the story of a poor man brutalized by the medical profession, the army, all those in authority above him, and who in turn then brutalizes his wife, his lover. And it's about sexual jealousy. It's kind of elemental, powerful, but also has a profound political story about the oppression of the working class.
Wow. I would love to find out more about that and perhaps ask you to come and talk to me about it.
Oh, I'd love to.
Oh, that's great, Karen. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for taking the time today. I've loved our conversation and to learn more about Spring Awakening.
Well, thank you.
As the curtain falls and Melchior takes off into the adventure of his life, and we assess what has happened to the young lives in the play, we can only hope that all young people may be given the nurturing love of encouraging parents, the education that enables them to understand the complicated impulses of sex and love, and to help define and defend moral standards that liberate the best behavior rather than repress what we fear or disagree with. Thanks for listening. See you next time. There are additional footnotes about this and every other play that we cover in the podcast available to our patrons. Patrons also enjoy exclusive access to the Play Review, bonus episodes in which I review current productions that I see in my regular theater going. To become a patron, visit patreon.com/theplaypodcast and follow us on Twitter and Facebook at The Play Pod and on Instagram at The Play Podcast. Thank you again for listening and for your support. See you next time.